Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the first webinar series of Medical Humanities. And this really has been an exciting journey for us, and we started this off in 2019 with the inaugural Night to Remember, if you all have attended it. Okay, and then subsequently we went on to screen videos related to tuberculosis, for example, and we even had readings by Prof. Wu. And today is our very first inaugural series where we would like to tackle some of the important issues in medical humanities. Today we'll be talking about inequality in Singapore. And with me, I'm very much pleasured and honored to have two very important local guests with me today. So I'll invite, I'll first introduce Dr. Lim Sufi. So she's a Deputy Director of Nursing of APNs, and it's a specialist nurse in rehab medication and RHS community nursing. So she did her training in rehabilitation in many well-renowned institutes, for example, the Institute of Chicago, the Michael E. DeBakey Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Houston, as well as the Durham Veterans Affairs Medical Center and Duke University School of Nursing in Durham as well. And she's now currently actively leading a team of community nurses in providing care to residents residing within the SingHealth Southeast communities of care. And so without much further ado, Dr. Lim, the stage is yours.
Thank you. A very good afternoon to everyone. So it's a privilege to be invited to have this session with all of you. So before I start, I thought it would be good for me to provide a little bit of background about myself. So after graduating in 1992 as a registered nurse, I worked in the rehabilitation wards and also in the training and development unit before becoming a specialty nurse in rehabilitation medicine in 2003. So I was in the rehabilitation medicine ward for 15 years before being tasked to lead the SingHealth Southeast RHS-led community nursing program. And that was in February 2008. So the RHS-led community nursing was established in February 2008 to anchor population health and also to facilitate the shift of care beyond hospital to the community. So what do? We provide the community nursing consults at the various community nurse posts, which are located within our 5 COCs. We also reach out extensively to our social and healthcare partners in the community to leverage on their strength through capability building and also strong partnerships. So our model of care is geographically based, and we provide services to residents who are residing within the 5 COCs, regardless of which hospitals or doctors they visit. Now, when we first started out, we had to engage many of our institution colleagues and also community partners. And we were often asked, what types of patients or residents can we refer to you? So we will say those aged 60 and above with 3 or more chronic diseases and those require assistance to manage their chronic conditions. But many of our community partners, they are non-healthcare workers. So they do not know whether the person has chronic diseases or not. But what they do know is there are at times it worries them when they leave some resident's house after the home visits or after the residents leave their centers. And I often joke with our ED colleagues that if they encounter patients who are not too sick to be admitted, and yet upon sending them home, it worries them and makes them feel uneasy. So do refer these patients to us. Now, as healthcare professionals, we always worry about our patients. We worry when they are admitted, and for some patients, we also worry when they are being discharged because we are not very sure whether they will continue to follow the recommended treatment plan, whether they will continue to respond well to the medication that we prescribe, or whether they will continue with their exercises. So these are our worries. So what about the worries of Singaporeans at large? Now, there's an interesting survey was done this year on 913 Singapore citizens aged 18 to 64 years old, asking them about which 3 of the following topics do they find most worrying in Singapore. And the top areas of concerns, as you can see here, were the job markets and unemployment at 48%, now, which is understandable. Healthcare at 42%, equally understandable, but guess what? Poverty and social inequality at 33%. So it is interesting to note of Singapore's concern for poverty and social inequality. And I think this is somewhat a valid concern, as while most of us know that Singapore has one of the highest per capita income in the world, there is still a significant proportion of those who are vulnerable. And there are nearly 20% of households who have a monthly household income of less than 2,000. Now, when thinking about opportunities in general, Singaporeans say there is some inequality according to different demographics of the population. 38% of Singaporeans feel that most inequality is experienced by people with disabilities, and 29% say inequality is most apparent between social classes. On government subsidies, most Singaporeans feel that the ideal scenario will be where low-income groups receive more government subsidies than high-income groups. Now, let us have a look closer to home, which is our SingHealth population landscape. Now, as you can see here, there are three distinct demographic differences within our three sites at the southeast, east, and the northeast. Focusing on the southeast, although it has the smallest proportion of population, as you can see here, the number of seniors aged 60 and above are high at 27% as compared to the east at 23% and northeast at 13%. The number of people living in one or two room flats are also high at 12%. So similarly, in comparing with the national resident population, as you can see here, the southeast side has the highest percentage of those aged 60 and above, which is shaded in brown. See here. And also those living in rental flats shading in pink. You can see the southeast side has a large proportion, about 10%, compared to the northeast and the east at 3%. Now looking at another data, you can see southeast also has the highest percentage in terms of those with 4 risks, as highlighted in red at 5%, those living alone, as well as those requiring financial assistance. So by and large, the southeast side generally have a larger proportion of the elderly living alone, staying rental flats, and requiring financial assistance. For the disability group, all the three sites are similar. So Singapore is being known as an affluent society, to have a very vibrant kind of adaptive knowledge-based economy, which produces much opportunities for employment and social mobility. So does inequality occur in Singapore? And the answer is yes. So in fact, inequality was mentioned as one of the most serious issues facing Singapore today, in addition to aging. As mentioned by our Home Affairs and Law Minister, K. Shanmugam, that Singapore has done relatively well in reducing inequality over the years through multiple lines of assistance. More has to be done. Now, let us have some understanding on equality and equity first. So now, while the terms equality and equity may sound similar, the implementation of one versus the other can lead to dramatically different outcomes, especially for marginalized people. Now, equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities, whereas equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Now, this means that the amount of resources and opportunities given are depending on respective needs. Have a look at the illustration below. As you can see, the two individuals on the first picture, the two individuals have unequal access to a system, in this case the tree that provides fruit. And the person on the left has abundance of fruits as compared to the other person on the right. With equal support, now look at the picture number 2, with equal support from evenly distributed tools, the distributed tools, which is the ladder, the access to the fruit still remains unequal. As you can see, the person on the right still can't reach the fruit. So the equitable solution, which is the third pick, allocates the exact resources that each person needs to access the fruit, leading to a positive outcomes for both individuals. So in this case, a higher ladder. So while the tree appears to be a naturally occurring system, it's critical for us to remember that social systems are not naturally inequitable. They may be intentionally designed to reward specific demographics for so long that the system's outcome may appear unintentional. So equity is the solution for addressing imbalanced social systems. And lastly, justice can take equity one step further by fixing the system in a way that leads to long-term, sustainable, equitable access for more generations to come. So in this case, as you can see on the picture on the extreme right, knowing that the tree is slanted towards one side and has more fruits, it gets adjusted so that both parties have equal opportunities to the fruit. But for today, we will just focus on equality. Now, I was very privileged to attend a speaking engagement series webinar by the Minister K. Shanmugam last month, and I wish to share some insights from the session. Now, he shared that creating an uplifting society, in recognition that there's a wide equality in Singapore. I mentioned in the context of three aspects: income, demographic, and geography. Now, for income, there is this middle income group in Singapore which has been moving very fast. So we have got very high level of middle income. It's about like 20% higher than the US, 30% higher than Sweden and Finland. So Singapore has a high level of middle income, and this creates a wider gap for the lower income group. And so not just the rich is doing well, but the middle income group is also doing very well in Singapore. Next is the demographic. So the economy remains a source of wide link between equality between the segment of old population and younger population. So if we have a look at the lower 10% of our wages, there are more than 50% age 55 and 45% above 55, and most have received limited education. In geography-wise, Singapore being in Asia, in a region where income are much more lower for majority of people, we have a large supply of the less skilled worker. So he cited mitigating income inequality, ensuring the social mobility, and enhancing the social integration was identified as critical in creating an uplifting society. So some strategies were recommended, but due to time constraint, I would just want to particularly focus on one, which is the extending through life, which is applicable to us. So the take-home message for me for his session was that company, society, government, and community, we should support lifelong learning. And as employers, we could collaborate with each other in the tertiary education, provide on-the-job training and internship. Now take some responsibilities to upskill and reskill employees, to develop them at work with mentors. So we need mentors, and learning at work is actually very critical. And in employment, we should not expect people who come out of school to be competent to do the job. In fact, we should focus on readiness to learn and not ready-made to work. And in particularly, and most importantly, we need to pay more attention to the older group through work fair, subsidized training, help them to keep jobs and preserve the sense of self-respect, being at work and also contributing. So, is inequality also evident in relation to health? For example, disease prevention strategies, which seem to have a greater impact on more affluent social groups. Is it true? And is there a health gap between those who have and those who have not? And also, do people from disadvantaged groups are more likely to have problems accessing health services? So, in a parliamentary Q&A highlights in May this year, there were also questions put forth by an MP to the Minister of Health on how does the ministry measure health inequalities in Singapore, and whether Singapore has made progress in tackling the health inequalities. So based on the written reply, which I extracted, which was mentioned, it seems that persons in the lower socio-economic group with chronic diseases, now they are using the educational levels as a proxy for socio-economic status. So those people in the lower socio-economic group with chronic diseases have good access generally have good access to healthcare services and healthcare outcomes. And among Singaporeans with primary education and below who have chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol, more than 90% had visited their doctor in the previous year for their condition. And they also had comparable disease outcome as compared with better educated Singaporeans in managing their blood sugar and cholesterol, although less so for the blood pressure control. And individuals can achieve good health outcomes by taking charge of their health, seeking timely intervention, and adopting healthy lifestyles, which we agree totally. And MOH facilitates this by reducing cost barrier to healthcare. For example, as we know, on health screening, subsidies under the Screen for Life were enhanced in September 2017, and under this revised scheme, the final generation pays $0 for screening, whereas those people who hold the CHAS Blue or Orange card, and also the Medicare generation, pay only $2, whereas the rest of us pay $5. And this payment covers screening tests, doctor's consultation, as well as the first follow-up consultation at the CHAS GP clinic. So, and MOH has committed to continue to monitor the health equalities and put in place measures to ensure that all Singaporeans have access to quality and timely healthcare. So, what can we do as healthcare workers to tackle health equality? So there was a proposed agenda for action which focuses on 4 areas: strengthening individuals, strengthening communities, improve access to essential facilities and services, as well as encouraging macroeconomic and cultural change. Now, each of these areas addresses some key factors which are thought to be antecedents of the health inequalities. So, namely, number 1, it seems that there are facets in an individual's natural or natural cultural makeup that influence their susceptibility and predisposition to disease and illness. And the communities in which people live will either mitigate or aggravate their health experiences, such as environment factors and also social resources. This could offset the stresses of life a person experiences. And also the ability of the person to utilize health services can effectively, affect or influence their health outcomes. And this can come in terms of prevention and treatment. And also there are structural forces such as relative and absolutely economic disadvantages that are fundamental to a person's experience of health. So not just an individual's motivation. So to enhance access to health services, it was recommended that there is a need to establish partnership with local community development workers based in the community. Firstly, to help the local people access health services and provide opportunities for health screening and education. And lastly, and most importantly, to establish an effective and meaningful relationship with the local community. Now, the third aim reflected the team's aspiration to become more rooted in the daily business of the community. So, for example, acting in the community rather than on it, be part of the neighborhood. So, being part of the neighborhood is also the way the model of the Chessled community nursing is embracing. So in order to establish an effective and meaningful relationship with the local community, we strategically cited our nurses and most of our community nurse posts at the senior activity centers, which is also where the rental flats are. And we feel that this allows us to work very closely with our community partners by being there, being accessible, and being part of them in the neighborhood. And our services are fully subsidized, meaning that the residents do not need to pay out of their pocket. So to date, we have about 31 continuous posts within the Southeast Zone. Now next, I would like to share a few stories on what I call missed opportunities to better health. These individuals, for reasons of either disadvantaged family background, poor health condition, physical or mental challenges, or perhaps misfortune, they were unable to access or less able to access available opportunities leading to better health for them. So perhaps in community nursing, we get to have more encounters with this group as compared to other colleagues in the hospital. And many complex cases that we see, have very challenging circumstances, which makes their maintenance of health very, very challenging. So this is Mr. M. He had been rough sleeping in a swimming complex for 1 month due to estranged relationship with his family members, and he had defaulted all his appointments, ran out of medication for his chronic condition, and running out of cash and food, he purchased biscuits high in sugar content to satisfy his hunger. So that makes his condition worse. Now, for those of you who are new to this group of homeless people, here are some facts. In fact, I also just got to know them last year from one of my community nurses, Chen Yu, and her husband founded the Homeless Heart Service. And we have got a lot to learn from this young couple. So here are some facts. So there are between 921 and 1,050 homeless people in Singapore, and they are geographically widespread with significant variation in numbers across districts. Majority of them are older men with irregular work and low pay, and mostly Singaporean citizens who are either single, separated, divorced, or widowed, and had low education. And they present in very diverse ways that are not consistent with the stereotypes of vagrancy and destitution. And most of them have poor health and nutrition. 3 main reasons has been identified for their homelessness status, which are insecure work and poverty, family relationship problems, inadequate or inaccessible housing services. Now you can see the link here between employment, poverty, which then affects the relationship. Accessible to housing services also plays a role here. Another case, Mr. T, 70 years old, who visited a doctor at the SOC and was scheduled for colonoscopy. He was briefed on bowel preparation by the clinic nurse, and because before he left the clinic and nearer to the colonoscopy date, he cannot remember the instructions and who to call, and he does not have a smartphone or data plan, and he does not qualify for telehealth VC. 2 other cases with very similar background or context. Mr. N, 36 years old, is wheelchair bound due to an accident sustained 2 years ago. Used to be very active in sports and goes to the gym often before his injuries, but now he has been cooping himself at home. And Mr. N, 65 years old, wheelchair bound, is dependent on his elderly partner to mobilize him outside his house. So without his partner, he will not be able to get out of his house. Even with his partner is actually quite reluctant to bring him out because of inconvenience. And he has not been going for his medical appointments and has not been taking his medication. Now, sharing the prevalence rate of the people with disabilities in Singapore in accordance to different population groups. As you can see, the student population and those below 50 years old, about 2 to 3%. 50 years and above, you can see is higher, 13.3% of the resident population. Now, although Singapore has progressed well in terms of being an inclusive society, there are still some barriers, for example, in terms of sports. It was found that only about 1/3 of the patients with disabilities participated in sports on a regular basis, which means at least once a week. And some of them needed modified physical education and sports program in schools to be able to participate. However, inclusive or adapted physical education and disability sports program remain a relatively new area in most schools in Singapore. And there are also inaccessible fitness facilities and health clubs, programs and equipments which are specific for people with disabilities, as well as the challenges of high program costs and also lack of transportation. So, from the data and the many stories presented and encountered in the community, we know that number 1, social and economic factors have a great influence on health as compared to clinical care. So social needs contribute to higher healthcare costs, and also having a social need leads to poorer health. And also based on a local study, there is also an association between public rental housing, readmission fees, and also increased utilization of hospital services. So one's health is perhaps shaped not just by personal motivation and genetic makeup, although we know that personal factors are important too, yeah? So in fact, the environment we live in and the people we interact with all exert profound influence on our health. So the question is, are social determinants matter too? And as we know that not all people are at the same starting point in the race for health. So as healthcare workers, given the well-described health effects of social needs, we have to ask ourselves this question: should we screen every patient for social determinants then? We are often faced with deciding whether we should screen our patient or for social needs. And also, what evidence do we need before recommending routine screening for social determinants of health? Now, we need to take note, the absence of evidence of benefit is not evidence that benefit is absent, so it's different. And conversely, some of the healthcare professionals' time with us with patient is limited. And so we can only focus on efforts that clearly have been shown to improve patient health and well-being. So what is really needed before we recommend routine screening? We need an accurate screening test to identify patients with social need. We need an effective treatment to address social need once identified, because in some cases, we know that screening identifies those with a need, but often we do not know what to do after we identify the need. And lastly, we also need evidence demonstrating that a meaningful health outcome improvement exists before we decide to screen. So I think a more reasonable approach may be to practice case finding instead. And this entails asking about or assessing social needs when a concern is apparent, but not asking every patient about every social determinant of health. And social needs may also surface when we take a history from patient. There are specific signs and symptoms may hint to us that the patient has a social need. So I think as healthcare professionals, our knowledge of the community we serve may also suggest that certain groups of patients are at greater risk of certain issues. So it's good to know that understanding a patient's social needs can also be part of getting to know our patient. But I think what is most important is that when social needs are identified, there must be actions to help to identify the local resources that can help them. So it's important to establish collaborative partnerships with community partners and organizations to care for those with recurring social needs in our patient population, and this cannot be emphasized enough. So to make the story complete, here is the part 2 of Mr. N. When he was first founded by the befrienders, they checked on his insulin and medication, because of befrienders some are healthcare professionals. So they checked on Mr. M's insulin and medication, and they noticed that he has got multiple chronic conditions. So subsequently, he was referred to the SGH committee nurse post for assessment. But before that, they spoke to us whether we can accommodate this group of people, and of course we said yes. So he was found to be in hyperglycemic state, very high blood sugar due to non-compliance, and he was sent to SGH to receive medical care. So he was admitted, and upon his discharge, he was temporarily placed in a safe sound sleeping place while waiting for long-term accommodation. So our SGH com nurses continue to manage his chronic conditions, and we work very closely with the medical social worker for his social and financial needs. Defenders continue to support him by accompanying him to his medical appointments, as well as the family service center appointments. And after several months, he finally got his own place to stay in a senior group home. For those who are not very familiar with the senior group home, it's an assisted living model, which the resident can co-reside independently in the HDB rental flat. And all these flats are retrofitted with elderly-friendly features. So after he got his own place, and due to the relocation, his medical care was transferred to NUH community nursing team, and also his social needs were well taken care of by the Alliance Befriender Cluster Support. And eventually, he reconciled with his family members and compliant to all his medication and medical follow-up. So in this case, you can see what he really needs, just a little bit of help and some awareness. These are some sharing some of the housing pathways or options available for the homeless, ranging from short term to long term, so that you are aware, just in case you come across some homeless people that needed housing services. And these are some of the agencies and government bodies that provide assistance to homeless people. There is also this network called the Partners Engaging and Empowering Rough Sleepers, formed by MSF in 2017. And today is made up of 26 public and social service agencies and community groups. So this network manages the shelters and provides social intervention for the homeless. For Mr. T, he was followed up by our community nurses, and we are proud to say that he was the first resident to embark on our telehealth pilot. So in this pilot, a lone tablet was dispatched to his home, whereby he could consult our nurses through VC on his health conditions and also on his preparation for his colonoscopy. And he was subsequently linked up for the mobile access scheme through our Y-Up project. So these are some of the mobile schemes available for seniors, the mobile access for seniors and Go Digital mobile plan. So these schemes offer very much subsidized mobile data plan as phone sets. Now, as healthcare professionals, we play a diverse role in society, often bridging individual and community perspectives. And we can all agree that advocacy is a core component of our professionalism. It is much more easier for us to be the patient's advocate because we have access to evidence regarding what works to improve their health and also what types of community resources and assistance schemes are available. So for people with disabilities, there are many barriers which strongly influence their mobility, also influence their access to health services and interaction with people and environment. So as healthcare professionals, we are in a position where we can have this unique opportunity to observe and also influence their adaptations to life. So by listening carefully, we can hear their concerns to be able to effectively advocate for their health and also social needs. Sharing some of the acts, the assistance schemes that are applicable for people with disabilities so that we can be their advocate. So this is the Mental Capacity Act, which allows people with mental capacity to appoint proxy and also protect their interests. And I would like to particularly mention about this Environmental Public Health Act and also the Rapid Transit System Regulation Act, which permits guide dogs into the food establishment, toilets, and also into our public transport, and this is very useful. There are various schemes for constructions of accessible features and modification. There are also schemes for assistive devices and technology, transport subsidies, and car park labels to allow driver or passenger with disabilities to park at accessible lots, whether it's in a HDB car park or in the public car park, and also to embark safely. And interestingly, there is also this scheme called the Appropriate Adult Scheme, where assistance is provided to people with intellectual or mental disability required to give statement to the police during investigation. For public transport assistance, they are also available in terms of the train bus captain, MRT staff to assist the wheelchair passengers, free bus ride, taxis. Nowadays, they will also have taxis which can accommodate high-back wheelchair as compared to many years ago. We have to book ambulance for patients requiring high-back wheelchair. There are also mobile and web systems for free rides and also communication. So there are some infrastructures in the MRT which are purposefully built for people with disability to make sure that they have got opportunities for better access. So for example, accessible elevator and also the wheelchair accessible train, although it's limited to 2 in each train. If for those of you who are taking MRT, after this session, you may want to pay more attention to the MRT train if you are taking train. So that limited to 2 in each train. So thought that more can be done. For example, more carriages with clearer visibility, and also the lift for people with wheelchair to be more centralized rather than at a far end. Also, there are also color-coded directions, tactile ground surface, and audio announcement for the visually impaired. There are also barrier-free entrance, and also, if you notice, some flashing red door closing and the lights for the hearing impairment. Some other features or infrastructures, as you can see, but I particularly want to highlight this SMRT active route map, and also the vacuum fluorescent display, as well as the practice, what we call, which are very useful for people with hearing impairment. So if you happen to take the MRT, to take note of all this. Yeah. And also, surprisingly, we also have what we call the Disability Sports Master Plan. So in January 2015, the NCCY convened an interagency committee for disability sports to raise awareness and also participation in disability sports for greater inclusiveness and understanding of people with disabilities through disability sports. So they identified 9 key barriers and also put forth 18 recommendations. So this is my last slide, and I hope that my sharing helps in some ways that could influence the way you view inequality, and also as healthcare professionals, how we can advocate for the patients and residents under our care. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Lim, for the very insightful talk. I learned personally, I learned quite a few things, because I never knew that we actually went out to buy people phones and teach them how to use laptops and all that. Yeah, so that was really good. I think we have some time, so maybe I'll just sort of take one of the questions that asked. Is there any overlap between sort of what you are doing in Home Nursing Foundation, and then if there is, how do you all sort of split the work?
Okay, so our model of care, or the way we operate, is really leveraging on what is strong in the community. So H&F has been in the community for a long time, and there are different scope of practices. So for community nursing, our focus is more on population health. Okay, and I do believe H&F also has some case management going on. So so we did collaborate, and so if, let's say, the patients, the residents have more of a chronic disease management requiring assistance for follow-up or maintenance, they can refer to us. Whereas for the Home Nursing Foundation, if, let's say, the residents have certain procedures that need to be done and requires maybe like long-term care, more than 2 weeks of procedure, because for their service is they are based on means testing, so it's a chargeable service, whereas ours is fully subsidized. So we have to be a bit careful in how we provide our services. And so in summary, ours is more on population health.
Okay. And I mean, from us, let's say in the hospital or in the outpatient setting, how do we actually get the patients to see? Or is it through the social worker, or is there a contact point where we can refer directly?
Yeah, so we receive referrals from all sources. It can be from institutions, can be members of the public. The resident can even walk in, but because of the COVID-19 situation now, they can't walk in, and they have to make appointment to see us. So we do have a referral form that enables any members of public or our colleagues to refer residents requiring chronic disease management or follow-up to refer to us. And we are happy to have closer collaboration. So we also collaborate with our colleagues in the hospital. So with this closer collaboration, it allows us to have more of like a two-way communication. Yeah.
I think just in interest of time, just one last question. Someone actually asked, can healthcare workers who are not doctors or nurses actually volunteer to help out?
Yes. So we encourage, whether you are healthcare workers or not, to join us because basically there are a lot of residents out there requiring a lot of assistance. For example, we need people to help to bring the loan tablets over to them. And now we are embarking on virtual health education, meaning that we are able to give health talks virtually. And even those residents who are at home, who are not able to come to the SACs, or other centers, if the volunteers are able to bring the tablets to them, they can actually join the virtual health education talk.
Yeah, so I think this is something very meaningful, and some food for thought. I think in the residency program, when we are looking for projects to help out in the community, I think this is something that's worth looking into. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, and I would like to introduce our next panelist for today. He's none other than Dr. Farid. I think all of you know him. He's a senior consultant in NCC, and he likes all the rare and interesting things. So he specializes in sarcomas and melanomas. He did his HMDP in Mount Sinai in New York, and he has a master's in public health as well. For all the people who need tips on PSLE, you'll be very happy to know that he was the top boy of his year. Okay, so if you need tips, please go and look for him. And he volunteers in the Migrant Workers Center and is a strong advocate for cancer in the community. So, Farid, all yours.
Thanks, Warren. Just give me a minute. I need to share my screen. Okay. Thank you, Warren. You guys can hear me well, right?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. Thanks for the invitation to speak. My name is Farid, as Warren has said, and I'm from medical oncology. And today I'm here to talk about whether inequality matters. I thought I'd start with some questions that we may all have about inequality. I think at different times in our life, all of us would probably have thought there seems to be something fundamentally problematic with widening inequality. But it's worth asking, what exactly is it that's wrong with this inequality? Clearly it's not a good thing to be poor and destitute, but why? Why exactly is the gap between the haves and the have-nots a problem in and of itself, if it's a problem at all? Why does it matter that, Elon Musk is worth billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, in fact, I think, as long as we continue to ensure that the most vulnerable amongst us have a decent chance at thriving. Also, inequality is often framed as a complex and highly contested socioeconomic issue with multiple moving parts that's perhaps beyond the grasp of any individual. Yet, as healthcare professionals, you and I know that we interact with inequality very directly, very viscerally in our day-to-day clinical work. So is there perhaps a need for us all to improve our grasp of the broader issues so that we can better take care of our patients? I thought it useful to start things off with two quotes that offer sort of seemingly differing positions on inequality to kind of set the tone for the rest of the talk. No less a figure than our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, had this to say about inequality. The human being is an unequal creature. That is a fact. And we start off with that proposition. All the great religions, all the great movements, all the great political ideologies say, let us make the human being as equal as possible. In fact, he's not equal, never will be. So typically forthright, candid, perhaps even blunt statement. This is how we are, so deal with it. The French economist Thomas Piketty had perhaps a different view. And he says every human society must justify its inequalities. Unless reasons for them are found, the whole political and social edifice stands in danger of collapse. Every epoch, therefore, develops a range of contradictory discourses and ideologies for the purposes of legitimizing the inequality that already exists, or that people believe should exist. Out of the clash of contradictory discourses comes a dominant narrative or narratives which bolster the existing inequality regime. So in his view, we learn to accept the inequalities because we believe or are made to believe that they are just. And this belief must be reinforced, if not society collapses. Of course, it bears noting that these are two very different men living in very, very different eras in very different parts of the world. And as with most quotes, what is unsaid is perhaps as important as what is said. So I hope to tease that out in today's talk. So what am I going to be talking about today? A little bit about the data, the economic data on inequality, some arguments on why it matters. I'll talk a little bit about migrant workers as the subjects of inequality in our midst. And I'll try and finish off with some ideas about what we can do at the bedside about this matter. I'd just like to say that there'll be a lot of arguments on making this talk. There's not that much by way of anecdote or data. I think I'll let, Sufi has gone through a lot of the nuts and bolts, but I thought it was important to clarify the philosophical positions, which I think is the area in which is most lacking in the discourse around inequality. So that will be my emphasis for today's talk. So how unequal are we? This is a map of the world, obviously, looking at GDP per capita across the world. And you can clearly see that the world is certainly very unequal, a fact that has many postulated ultimate causes, including varying endowments, geographic endowments of natural resources and environmental factors, as was discussed and described in this famous book, Guns, Germs and Steel, many years ago, which led countries to have different winners and losers when it came to plagues, wars, and the like over the years. But the way this map is relevant to today's talk is two things I'd like to emphasize. One is that one of the strongest predictors for human well-being across a variety of indicators is simply the country of birth. So this map is truly very significant in the study of differences in human flourishing. And secondly, it's also this map is also one of the key drivers of global migration, including the global market for guest workers or migrant workers, as we call them, with workers trading their labor for wages, and more affluent countries as consumers, Singapore obviously being one of them. This is a look at global inequality in a slightly different way, looking at the capture of economic growth over a period of time, in this case between 1980 to 2016. And you can see, the lowest deciles of income across the world captured about 12% of total growth in the last 40-odd years, corresponding to the rise of emerging countries like India and China. And then there's a large band of the middle deciles who stagnated, corresponding to the middle class in the West primarily. And then this is the top 1% of income earners in the world in the last 40-odd years. The top 1% divided into three columns, and they captured about 27% of total growth. So clearly a lot of inequality in the last 40-odd years, and because the shape of the curve approximates an elephant, it's called the elephant curve of inequality. And obviously this period coincides with the era of neoliberalism, where one lives and dies by the rules of the market, the exponential growth of financial industry, and the explosive rise and power of big tech corporations whose reach into our individual lives is unparalleled in human history. So clearly, a lot of inequality and growing inequality in the last 40-odd years across the world. I also wanted to mention a little bit about how inequality changes in different eras. This shows the level of inequality across the 20th century and into the early years of the 21st, looking at the wealth share of the top 1% of the population. So you can see that the world was very unequal, at least in the countries that were looked at in the early part of the 20th century, with the top 1% owning up to 60% of wealth, in some countries. This was in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And then after that, inequality gradually declined, due to the world wars, the Great Depression, and many countries' responses to these devastations, like restricting capital flows, nationalizing industries, and greater government control over the economy, leading to, in the 50s and 60s, the marginal tax rates of the top income bracket in America approaching 90%. And then after that, we come to this era, which I just described, through the elephant curve I just mentioned. The take-home message is that inequality is far from constant. The levels of inequality changes very significantly from era to era, both due to contingencies of wars and economic downturns, as well as specific government policies. So it's not in any way static. What about the economic inequality in Singapore? Well, these are data just I think published last year about income inequality in Singapore over the last 10 years. So the data are fairly favorable. I mean, there's been growth in income across all income deciles and relatively stable Gini coefficient over the last 10 years or so, well, 6-7 years or so. Just a quick word about the Gini coefficient. For those who are not familiar, essentially it plots the cumulative proportion of population ranked by income from lowest to highest against the proportion of income. And it's measured by taking, dividing the pink area by the pink plus blue area. So, the larger the pink area, the higher the Gini coefficient and the higher the inequality, because clearly, with a large pink area, a very small percentage of population earns a lot of the income. It bears reminding, though, that this looks at income inequality, not wealth, and also it looks at income inequality only from work, which means it excludes income from shares, stocks, rent, royalties, capital gains, which obviously some may argue is more relevant to the income of those who earn more. But be that as it may, these are the data, from Singapore over the last 10 odd years. Next, I just want to touch a bit on, this issue of social mobility. Social mobility is arguably the single best, albeit indirect, indicator of equality of opportunity, which is obviously one of the fundamental foundation stones of meritocracy. If you assume abilities and talents to be evenly distributed across the population, then any association between social background and outcomes across generations can be inferred as evidence of lack of opportunity. How do we measure social mobility? Well, one simple way is to look at intergenerational outcomes. But a report commissioned by the World Economic Forum released early this year focused instead on drivers and enablers of relative social mobility to come up with a global social mobility score. And these are the data for Singapore. So the composite score, Singapore ranks 20th amongst 82 countries. Doing quite well on certain measures, but quite poorly on measures like fair wage distribution and social protection. This report was also able to show a nice negative correlation between social mobility and income inequality. Countries with lower income inequality have high social mobility. Now, social mobility is known to be both a cause and low social mobility is known to be both a cause and consequence of rising inequality. So, this data I expected, and I guess soft validation of the validity of this index. And Singapore, as you can see, compared against other countries, did okay. I mean, not as good as the Nordic countries and some of the other European countries, Japan, but better than other countries. This is obviously something that Sufi talked about earlier, social determinants of health, and how there is a social gradient in health. This I'm just showing data from the Mohamad review. Sir Michael Mohamad is obviously a world leader in the study of social determinants of health, and he was commissioned to look at health inequity in England, where they have developed a deprivation index, looking at income, employment, education, etc., and dividing different geographic areas of the United Kingdom into the most deprived and the least deprived areas. And the data show that patients who live in the most deprived areas had higher mortality compared to the least deprived areas. This obviously is something that he's shown many times before, and is kind of accepted. Just something to bear in mind, that whenever we look at such data, we should always bear in mind that we should take into account of things that could threaten causal inference, like confounding, and the other thing is reverse causation. Low socioeconomic status can cause poor health, but poor health can also cause low socioeconomic status. Now, clearly, we can't do randomized controlled trials with social deprivation as the intervention. So there are many epidemiologic techniques to control for these threats to causal inference. But certainly, there's something to always bear in mind whenever we look at such data. But what about socioeconomic status and health in Singapore? I think Sufi mentioned this already, but I just wanted to highlight one or two aspects of this actual exchange between the NMP and the Ministry of Health. This is, of course, published on the Ministry of Health website. So NMP Anthea Ong actually asked specifically, what is the difference in life expectancy, percentage of prevalence of chronic conditions, and acute hospital 30-day readmission rate between comparing the highest two and the lowest two deciles of income in the population. So essentially looking at the disparities in health outcomes. And actually the first line of the reply was that data on life expectancy, hospital 30-day readmissions, and prevalence of chronic conditions by income groups is not available. And subsequently, the reply goes on to mention most of the things which I think Sufi has mentioned, multiple factors influencing readmissions, some correlation with educational status, there's good access to healthcare across the board, and we should all take charge of our health. But I think it was quite telling that by our own admission, we don't have much data on health disparities by income groups in Singapore. Although there are of course some data, and I think I'm just showing one publication. This is by Ting Hui and Gopal and colleagues, looking at survival differences in head and neck squamous cell carcinoma patients by home size, and patients who lived in smaller homes had poorer survival, even though they were not more likely to present with advanced disease, suggesting that the survival difference was not due to delayed presentation. Again, the caveats regarding reverse causation, confounding, etc. But certainly we need more data like this across all subspecialties and subtypes of diseases. So just some tentative conclusions about inequality that I wanted to make just to end this section. Global inequality has clearly risen significantly, and this has implications for many issues which are of relevance to Singapore, including migration and migrant labor. Levels of inequality have varied across different periods. They're not static. There is a well-established social gradient of health. The inequality in Singapore is relatively stable in recent years, if not quite unsubstantial. And inequality in health in Singapore, by our own admission, we need more data. So why exactly does all this matter? Who cares about all these things? Why should we think more about such matters? Perhaps I'll start by considering some arguments from those who think that inequality doesn't really matter. It's not something we need to think about too much. A common refrain is that meritocracy is the foundation stone of our society. And certainly it should be tempered by taking care of those who are less fortunate, prioritarianism. But the fundamental bedrock of our society should be meritocracy. Egalitarianism, on the other hand, interferes with individual liberty and suppresses human agency, the human ability to chart his or her own course in life, thus obstructing human flourishing. Pursuing egalitarianism logically leads to the absurdities of leveling down. The best way to achieve equality is to make everyone poor. That's a leveling down objection. Curbing inequality would dampen economic growth, some say. Envy is not a legitimate consideration of justice. And inequality is inescapable. We can't change it. That's just the way things are. We just have to live with it. Before I address those objections, I'd just like to make a proposal for what I would sort of suggest are axioms of justice from which we can discuss these matters. First and foremost, justice is fundamental to our needs and the foundation of organized human existence. I don't think this is in question. It's certainly important to everyone in general, and specifically to the issue of inequality, because those who think something must be done about inequality, as well as those who feel other principles like meritocracy are paramount, both argue from considerations of justice. So justice is clearly important. Second, that human beings have equal moral worth. Now, this is perhaps self-evident to some, but perhaps not necessarily to all. Although I will say that this, principle is not necessarily in tension or in opposition to those who believe humans to be inescapably unequal. Because even if we have different endowments of goods, resources, abilities, we can still emphasize equality in terms of social relations, like authority, status, standing, what is term the difference between distributive egalitarianism and relational egalitarianism. So whether or not we promote this relational egalitarianism is an active choice. It's not a matter of a reality we must accept. And last, I would venture to suggest that the common good is critical to preserve and cultivate in a well-functioning society. This includes, what is a common good? It includes tangible public goods like air, roads, public parks, the police, as well as many intangibles, chief amongst which I would suggest to be the stockpile of trust, civic-mindedness, and care and concern for fellow human beings. Now, of course, some people will say that this is just wishy-washy stuff, but I do think that it is something that is important for societies, to function properly. Now, moving forth from these axioms, I want to take a step at evaluating the benefits and the merits and demerits, as it were, of using meritocracy as our foundation stone. Now, these are the two fundamental bedrocks of meritocracy: equality of opportunity and intergenerational social mobility. And in the best case scenario, they feed into each other in a positive feedback loop, to foster a thriving society. But problems start to arise when we characterize the successful as winners and the unsuccessful as losers, and then we try to resolve this within the larger framework of equal concern or equal moral worth and the common good. For example, taking equality of opportunity, I think Sufi touched on this a little bit. It needs to be substantive, because availability is not the same as access. There are multiple barriers that vulnerable groups face in accessing resources that are ostensibly available to them. I think the biggest barrier they face is the availability of time. People who are vulnerable have very little time to do things that we think are important for their health or for other things, because they're so busy trying to stay afloat. Then there's the issue of equal concern. There are disparities in agency, influence, and status amongst different groups of people. So if we apportion concern according to the ability and likelihood of people to protest or hold us accountable, if we take care of patients who are more likely to complain, to put it in simple terms, better than those who are not, then clearly the requirement of equal concern is violated. Then there is also an issue with intergenerational social mobility, because meritocracy does lead to the transmission of intergenerational advantage. There is a dynastic component to meritocracy, and in that one respect, it's not altogether different from aristocracy, which is obviously the system that it was designed or conceived to counter. And then there are several aspects of meritocracy that can be corrosive to the common good. For example, we tend to confuse the efficiency, which is an important aspect of meritocracy, with the sense of worthiness. Of course, we must match ability and aptitude to work. The best and most able must do the most difficult jobs. But such a process should be viewed as a purely procedurally efficient one, and as far as possible dissociated from any moral desert or worthiness attached to success and failure. Because even if there was a rational way of comparing the worth of human lives, and there probably isn't, success and failure would not be it. Then, a lot of times we have outsourced merit to the market, Instead of a priori deciding what generates meaningful value for society and then assigning a price based on that value, we use price as a measure of value, And this goes some way to explaining why the contributions of many who do clearly essential work like caregiving and teaching, for example, get undervalued relative to other more financially profitable endeavors, whatever true value they create or indeed even destroy, like speculative financiers, for example. And lastly, I would like to suggest that there is a chance that the more privileged in society, the more affluent, can start to secede from society because they need less public goods, leading to degradation of public services, less social spending, private provision of goods. So these are all threats that can erode the common good. So these are some of the problems with meritocracy, where in reality it doesn't function as well as we want it to. So going back to the sort of objections to the objectionability of inequality I raised earlier, here are some counter-arguments. We have not lived up to the meritocratic ideal, ensuring substantive equality of opportunity with every generation. Additionally, the moral desert we assign to success or failure can corrode the common good, as I've described earlier. People say egalitarianism interferes with individual liberty. Well, the agency of people who don't have a lot can also be relatively curtailed without substantive equality of opportunity. And the corrosive effects of meritocracy on the common good may compromise the realization of a more complete conception of freedom. The leveling down objection is, I would suggest, essentially a strawman argument, because we can't and shouldn't eradicate inequality, but the idea is to reduce and restructure it. And that's what we want to try and achieve. For example, John Rawls, the famous political philosopher, suggested that inequality is just if and only if it serves the needs of the least advantaged in society. Curbing inequality would dampen economic growth. Well, the economic evidence would seem to suggest otherwise. Envy is certainly not a legitimate consideration of justice, but the relevant ones, as I mentioned, are equal moral worth and the common good. And as we've seen, the historical record has demonstrated that levels of inequality actually fluctuate significantly during different eras, due to many reasons, of course. But there isn't any real evidence that levels of inequality stay equal throughout. So I wanted to just switch gears a little bit and talk about, talk a little bit about migrant workers as a group of people who may be on the wrong end of inequality in our midst. I thought it, useful to try and consider the position of migrant workers, on this conceptual graph that I kind of came up with, plotting on the x-axis, the duration of stay in a country, and on the y-axis, the social goods that different groups of people have access to, namely societal integration, healthcare access, and political representation. So generally, different groups, exist on a straight line. Tourists, obviously stay for a very short time, and they have virtually no access to social goods, in the country that they visit, compared to citizens and PRs on the other end of the spectrum. And along that line, exchange students, refugees, skilled foreign talent. But low-wage migrant workers do not, I think we all agree, exist along that line. They stay for a very long time, do a lot of work, but have very limited access to the social goods that I mentioned. Certainly, they have no political representation in the receiving societies. And some will say, well, that's the way it should be, because they remit money back to their home countries. That constitutes an economic loss. They don't pay any taxes, so they don't deserve these social goods. And if they have non-work, if they don't have any injuries, they have healthcare problems that are not related to injuries, then that's not the responsibility of the receiving society. Now, these can certainly be countered, I would suggest. There are certainly some data to suggest that even just looking at purely transactionally, there's economic net gain to the receiving country by having migrant workers around. You could certainly argue that the levies paid out by their employers for employing them can constitute taxes on their income. And there is a self-defeating welfare loss from unmanaged conditions. If they're not healthy, they can't work. And above all that, I think we need to think very hard about whether there should be limits to a purely transactional approach when we aim to decide what is the proper manner to treat fellow human beings living and working amongst us. Surely there must be some moral limits to such a purely transactional approach. This is a publication by Sean Vasu and colleagues that was published, I think, last year, looking at it was a survey of the knowledge of doctors regarding rules about migrant workers. And, the results are pretty telling. I think the knowledge was not very good at all. Only 50%, for example, knew that migrant workers' health insurance typically does not cover outpatient healthcare costs. That was false. About 67% knew that employers are ultimately responsible for migrant workers' healthcare costs, whether or not they were work-related. And you could argue that the level of knowledge is commensurate with, how much, what repercussions you have for not knowing these things, right? Which are, there are virtually no repercussions for doctors not knowing much about the rules around migrant workers. And I thought it would be useful to kind of sort of fleshing this out by a schematic to show the relational dynamics in migrant worker healthcare when they fall ill. First and foremost, I think we should all realize that migrant workers have a dual relationship with their employers. One is that of a boss and subordinate, but there is also the relationship between a guardian and his ward. Now, this is clearly a very abnormal relationship, which most of us don't have. It's clearly laden with potential conflicts, given that an employer who seeks to maximize labor output needs to, at the same time, care for the non-work related health of his worker. It's a conflict of interest that comes to a head if and when the migrant worker falls ill, not from injury. When a migrant worker does fall ill, then he gets care from physicians. Again, this relationship is more asymmetric than it is for fully integrated members of society who are more familiar with the system and know how to seek redress if issues arise. If it's a serious illness, when the bills start mounting, and the 15K inpatient insurance cap is exceeded, then a tug of war starts to arise between the public, the healthcare facility, the employees, and the medical practitioner. A tug of war that I've been, involved in more times than I would like to have liked, to be honest. But anyway, essentially, there is a pushback from all the parties when it comes to managing the migrant workers' healthcare once the bills start mounting. Although, by law, the employee is expected to foot the bill, whatever the illness. And one reason this dynamic arises is because these three parties, employers, healthcare facility, medical practitioners, as I showed earlier, they are on equal social footing. They have equal access to redress, representation, whenever they feel that anything is unjust. Whereas the migrant workers are a social underclass, and they represent the path of least resistance for resolution of this conflict, without, I would venture to suggest, much repercussions for the three parties here, whatever the outcome for the migrant worker. So the doctor is a real keystone or gatekeeper for the health and well-being of the migrant worker. And that's something that I think we should all bear in mind whenever we treat migrant workers. I'd just like to mention a few things about considerations of justice when it comes to migrant worker healthcare. Just one line about global inequality and how it feeds into this. On the one hand, people will say guest worker programs, migrant worker programs allow some measure of global redistribution, because these workers work in more affluent countries, they remit money to their home countries, there is some income flow, in a way that is redistributed. On the other hand, they do not address and perhaps reinforce the structural factors, power asymmetries that contribute to the lack of equal concern for these workers. So it is not, there are certainly problems with the issue at a global level that obviously needs to be tackled as well. It also bears mentioning, I think we should all, not shirk away from this, the economic logic of guest worker programs requires migrant workers to occupy a status of underprivilege, because if they were afforded the full complement of rights and privileges enjoyed by citizens, then the very value proposition of migrant labor is undermined, and this clearly increases the probability of exploitation and domination. I thought it was important also to address this thing that I often hear from others, that they came here of their own volition, voluntarily, so if they don't like it, they could have chosen not to come, or they could leave. I think this is inadequate and irrelevant, actually, because they start from a position of considerable weakness, given the initial circumstances, and at the mercy of people with more information and power than them at every step of the way. There's no real choice between equal alternatives at any step of the way. In fact, when they, once they arrive here, there's no way they can unilaterally change their jobs. And then there's also the issue about, which I raised earlier, the moral limits of markets, about adopting a purely transactional approach. We regularly impose limits on market forces to preserve the integrity of critical societal norms, Obviously we don't allow trading in organs, human organs, for obvious reasons. Although if it was purely a market-based logic, it would make sense. So characterizing migrant worker issues as purely transactional is somewhat, disingenuous, I would say, because it avoids the real discussion about basic standards and norms. Finally, I'd like to touch a bit about what we can do at the bedside. Just some ideas and some thoughts. Again, Sir Michael Mohamad, he came out with this declaration of Oslo to get clinicians or physicians to think a bit about health equity. A few of these things, workforce education and all that. I thought I'd just highlight two things. One is that the one I highlighted, working with individuals and communities. As Sufi has shown very nicely, at the end of the day, a patient's health is inextricably entwined with the social environment. So we need to expand the bedside. We need to actively think about this every time we see a patient in the ward. And I'm reminding myself as much as anyone else, the health doesn't begin and end, begin at admission and end at discharge. Clearly, it seems sort of absurd to think otherwise, but I think it does bear reminding. The other big piece, I think, is the health sector, is how we structure our working environment. Firstly, we should embody equitable practices, even amongst colleagues, amongst colleagues at different levels of seniority, but even more importantly, I think we should support each other to act for health equity, because it is challenging and tiring, and we can all too easily slip into rationalizing unequal concern. So that's something that we need to support each other to pursue health equity. I'd just like to mention just a few reminders for daily practice, again, as much to myself as to everyone else. Healthcare provision without health improvement is meaningless. Inequality, I think we all know that. And inequality accounts for a substantial portion of this gap. As physicians, we interact directly and intimately with inequality constantly. This unique access is an opportunity to study it and clarify its impact, a responsibility to mitigate its ill effects on health, and a challenge to stay true to our fundamental duties of care. I think when the underprivileged interact with doctors, the equal concern we provide them is unique. It's uncommon in their lives, and it's something very precious to both us and them, which we should cherish and preserve. And I'd just like to sort of suggest that our duties to individual patients and the wider society, which is to preserve the principal public good of trust, neatly converge when we actively strive for equitable health delivery, as opposed to just equal healthcare provision in our day-to-day practice. This bank of public trust in the integrity and impartiality of physicians is probably the most precious resource we have, whose loss cannot be easily quantified in the short term, but whose longer-term corrosive effects can be easily appreciated. Many things like lower trust in doctors' advice, litigation, and the like. So this issue of public trust is critical, and striving for health equity is one of the best ways to preserve that trust. Finally, I'd just like to finish with some final take-home messages. I think it's important to realize, or at least I think so, issues of justice, ethics, and professionalism require clarity of thinking as much as, if not more than, compassion, because with normative positions clear and actively adopted, rather than muddled and passively accepted. Philosophical introspection cannot provide empirical evidence, but its emphasis on internal consistency is one safeguard against self-deception and injustice. I like to say that I think the rules of the social world are largely not fundamental laws of nature, but they're designed and thus potentially malleable. Inequality may have been the case for most of civilization, but emphasizing equality of social relations, again, relational egalitarianism, not necessarily distributive, was a form of moral progress in concert with all our technological and material progress we have achieved, which we should cherish and uphold. Inequality matters if we accept the truth of equal moral worth and the importance of the common good. it matters because we are all only as safe as the most vulnerable within our midst, and nature cannot be fooled. I don't think we need to be reminded that in a year 2020, when a strand of RNA brought the entire human race to its knees, it would do us well to remember that, as we have learned right here in Singapore, that we are only as safe as the most vulnerable amongst us. And inequality matters because we are duty bound to patients and our profession, as well as because trust is priceless to the practice of medicine and the thriving of society. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Farid. Thank you for the great talk. I think we don't have much time, but don't worry. There's lots of questions. We will actually try and answer them individually. We don't have time to cover it, but maybe just one or two questions. I have quite an interesting question here. Someone mentioned that a lot of the issues with healthcare and access seem to be linked to poverty rather than inequality. Do you think that this is the case? And if so, is there anything that we can do to sort of level the playing field?
Well, level the playing field, by definition, is reducing inequality, right? But I mean, yeah, certainly, as I said, there's absolutely no doubt that a lack of distributional resources, goods, money, time, that the lack of that is certainly. I don't think there's any doubt between any groups of people that's important, and that needs to be addressed. But over and above that, I think, as I've tried to show, the gap, regardless of how much people at the bottom have, the gap is also something that needs to be addressed. So I think both needs to be addressed in concert. That's what I would say. And across the board, from the top to bottom, policy making, institutions, and obviously at our level. And as I said, the thing we can do as individuals, as physicians, I think at the bedside, is to be more, cognizant of these issues, and to be more, how shall I say, disciplined, to ensure that, for the reasons I've tried to mention, that we achieve health equity at the bedside. It's difficult. It's tiring. I mean, even for myself. Whenever I get referred migrant workers, for example, in my mind, I'm already thinking, oh man, I have to deal with. There's be so many issues that I have to deal with. I already feel that way to begin with, and it's hard. It's tiring. But so we need to help each other, support each other to try and achieve that.
I think because this touched on a very interesting point, because recently I myself had a patient who needed biologics, which is very expensive medication for treatment of his ankylosing spondylitis. And like you, I faced the same problem because the company doesn't want to pay, the company makes it difficult for the patient, and then the patient also feels bad, and then they sort of refuse treatment and so on. I mean, when you encounter such cases, how do you go about with this?
There's no simple situation. I think with a lot of help, with support from each other, I think the difference. Just very briefly, in situations where patients are stable and we can ensure good continuity of care in their home country, that's something that we generally pursue for cancer. At least when they are unstable, obviously we strive very hard, and it's to stabilize them and establish continuity of care in their home country. That's the general way of I approach it. Ensure that they get excellent acute care and that there's a good continuity of care somewhere. If there can't be good continuity of care, then certainly we need to get help from philanthropy, etc.
In your interaction with the migrant workers, do you happen to know of any sort of funding available for them, or?
So, I think the NGOs does have some resources for catastrophic illness and situations which are really challenging. Although I think the need is far outweighs the the availability of such resources. So yeah, I think it's important that we come to gradually a more maybe productive social compact to sort of move the needle when it comes to I think universal healthcare for migrant workers is probably a bridge too far, but yeah, I think the needle needs to be moved, and then we are in a better position than most, because we know exactly what happens to them.
I think I'll just, in interest of time, we'll just take one last question. I think this is for Sufi. I think earlier on you mentioned that there was a lot of community support available, but is there any way to sort of make it more seamless and for those in need to actually access these resources? Because I think at the moment it's still a lot of patient dependent where they have to sort of initiate this.
So there are various schemes and there are various services launched by the Ministry of Health. They funded many programs. So for instance, for in our case, we also have the H2H, hospital to home. We have the community nursing, and we also have the geriatric service hub service. So all this sometimes is available, but the residents, they do not know, and because they do not know, they are unable to access to this system. So I think back to what I said, it's important for us to be their advocate. So we do partner with many community partners. So I think leveraging on community partners is very, very important, and they are able to reach out to many residents. So and they're very familiar with the residents and the environment and how things work in their community. So different communities have different strengths and also areas for improvement. So we need to know. So I find that collaborating with them actually helps us to access to more residents who are in need. And many of them do some door knocking, and also through some referrals or circumstances, they know of some residents with certain needs, and they will refer appropriately. But of course, there are more to be done in terms of identifying the different services. Even sometimes I myself also I have to navigate. When I come to a new community or new district, I have to familiarize myself with all the services available. So is these services are available, but it's the access to these services that is the issue lah. So I think for us, we can do our part, by bridging that.
Thanks very much. So I think in the interest of time, we have to end here. Thank you very much, Farid and Sufi, for all your time and great insights. We have more questions than we can answer them, unfortunately, but don't worry. We
can communicate over email. Over email.
Okay, so once again, thank you, Dr. Farid and Dr. Lim. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next webinar series. And it will be something exciting. So I won't let the cat out of the bag first. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.